The pages had not seen daylight for centuries. Bound in leather now cracked and worn by the passage of nearly 500 years, the manuscript emerged from obscurity in 2007 at a small auction house in Munich, Germany. The book dealer who first held it in his trembling hands could scarcely believe what he was seeing. Page after page of vivid illustrations, painted in gouache and watercolor, depicted scenes so extraordinary, so alien to the modern eye. Spheres of fire hung suspended in Renaissance skies. Dragons with pig-like snouts swarmed over Bohemian villages. Blood rained from the heavens while terrified peasants looked upward in supplication. 3 suns blazed simultaneously over medieval cities. This was the Augsburg Book of Miraculous Signs, a manuscript that had been created sometime between 1545 and 1552 in the prosperous German trading city of Augsburg, and it would soon be recognized as one of the most spectacular discoveries in the field of Renaissance art in modern memory. James Faber, a London-based dealer in rare books and manuscripts, acquired the volume shortly after its appearance at auction. As he carefully turned each of its 169 surviving folios, he understood that he was holding something far more significant than a mere curiosity. This was a window into the 16th century mind, a time when the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural remained fluid, when comets were harbingers of doom and monstrous births were messages from an angry god. The book was eventually sold into an American private collection, where it remained until the German publisher Taschen produced a complete facsimile edition in 2013, finally revealing its contents to the wider world. The story of the Augsburg Book of Miracles is inseparable from the story of the city in which it was created, and the tumultuous era that gave birth to its terrifying visions. In the middle decades of the 16th century, Augsburg stood at the crossroads of European civilization. Founded by the Romans in 15 BC and named Augusta Vindelicorum after the Emperor Augustus himself, the city had grown over 15 centuries into one of the most important commercial and financial centers on the continent. The great banking families of the Fuggers and the Welses had established their headquarters there, amassing fortunes so vast that they could finance the election of Holy Roman emperors and lend money to kings. Jakob Fugger, known to history as Jacob the Rich, had died in 1525, but his legacy shaped every aspect of Augsburg's identity. The Fugger family had replaced the Medici of Florence as Europe's preeminent bankers, funding the wars and ambitions of the Habsburg dynasty, while simultaneously creating the Fuggerei, the world's first social housing project, which still shelters the poor of Augsburg to this day. The Fuggers remained loyal to the Roman Catholic Church, even as the Protestant Reformation swept through Germany, and this religious tension would prove central to understanding the Book of Miracles. Augsburg in the 1550s was a city poised between worlds. Its magnificent Renaissance architecture, including the Fugger Chapel in the Church of St. Anna, completed in 1518, represented the first flowering of Italian Renaissance style north of the Alps. Its printing houses produced more German-language books than any other city in the Holy Roman Empire, second only to Wittenberg in publishing the works of Martin Luther. Artists like Hans Holbein the Elder and Hans Berkmair had made the city a center of humanist learning, yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and progress, anxiety gnawed at the collective soul of Augsburg's inhabitants. The Protestant Reformation had torn Christendom apart. Martin Luther had posted his 95 Theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg in 1517, and in the decades that followed, religious warfare had engulfed much of Europe. Catholics and Protestants viewed each other with suspicion and hatred. Each side believed the other to be agents of the Antichrist, and both watched the skies for signs of God's impending judgment. It was in this atmosphere of religious terror and millennial expectation that an unknown patron commissioned the creation of the Augsburg Book of Miraculous Signs. The identity of the manuscript's creator remains one of its enduring mysteries. The name of the Augsburg artist and printmaker Hans Berkmair appears on one page of the manuscript, but scholars have concluded that this must refer to Hans Berkmair the Younger, the far less famous son of the renowned painter who had died in the 1530s. The elder Berkmair had been one of the masters of the Northern Renaissance, a friend of Albrecht Dürer and a court artist to Emperor Maximilian I. His son, working in his shadow, left little mark on art history apart from his possible involvement in this extraordinary project. The text of the manuscript draws from Martin Luther's German Bible translation of 1545, which provides a terminus post-chem for the book's creation. The final datable event depicted in its pages is a devastating hailstorm that struck the Dutch town of Dordrecht on May 17, 1552, where hailstones reportedly weighed several pounds each and filled the air with a terrible stench. This places the completion of the manuscript around that year in the final tumultuous years before the Peace of Augsburg would temporarily halt the religious wars in 1555. The patron who commissioned this lavish work remains unknown, given its enormous expense, with each of its 169 pages featuring large-format illustrations in gouache and watercolour enhanced with gold highlights. It must have been created for someone of considerable wealth. Perhaps it was one of Augsburg's merchant princes, seeking to understand the signs of the times. Perhaps it was a Protestant burgher collecting evidence of God's warnings to a sinful world. Perhaps it was a scholar or humanist driven by that same curiosity about natural phenomena that would eventually give birth to modern science. Whoever commissioned it clearly shared the obsession that gripped 16th century Europe, the conviction that the world was approaching its end and that God was sending signs to prepare the faithful for what was to come. The Book of Miracles begins, appropriately enough, at the beginning. Its opening pages depict scenes from the Old Testament, starting with Noah's Ark bobbing on a roiling blue sea littered with drowning animals and humans. The Ark itself appears almost cheerful, a brightly coloured vessel riding serenely above the chaos of divine judgment. In subsequent pages, the plagues of Egypt unfold in vivid detail, with frogs and locusts swarming over terrified Egyptians while Moses raises his staff against the darkened sky. These biblical scenes established the theological framework for everything that followed. In the worldview of 16th century Christians, the miracles of the Old Testament were not merely ancient history, they were precedents, demonstrations of God's power and willingness to intervene directly in human affairs. If God had parted the Red Sea for Moses, if he had rained fire and brimstone upon Sodom and Gomorrah, then surely he would continue to send signs and wonders to his people as the final days approached. From the biblical narratives, the manuscript transitions to what Joshua Waterman of the Germanisches National Museum in Nuremberg has called hallucinatory accounts of classical and contemporary celestial phenomena. The citizens of 16th century Augsburg, like their counterparts throughout Europe, believed that the heavens were a canvas upon which God wrote his messages to humanity. Every comet, every meteor, every unusual arrangement of celestial bodies carried meaning that demanded interpretation. The book contains what may be the second largest early collection of comet illustrations ever assembled, depicting these celestial visitors in stunning detail. A comet from the year 117 gave off fire and flames in all directions before falling to Earth, where it was seen in both Germany and Italy. A comet from 1506 stayed in the sky for several days and nights and turned its tail towards Spain, after which a lot of fruit appeared, only to be completely destroyed by caterpillars or rats, followed by a violent earthquake in Constantinople. To modernize, these connections between celestial events and earthly disasters appear absurd, the product of superstition and coincidence. But for the people of the 16th century, such connections were self-evident truths. God controlled both heaven and earth, and he frequently used one to communicate his intentions regarding the other. Comets were not merely balls of ice and rock following predictable orbital paths, they were divine messengers, harbingers of plague, war, famine, and death. Among the most remarkable illustrations in the entire manuscript is a depiction of an event that allegedly occurred in October 1533 in the Kingdom of Bohemia and the neighbouring region of Vogtland. The caption, written in German Gothic script, describes a mass sighting of flying dragons. In the year 1533, in October, flying dragons were seen in Bohemia and the Vogtland, as well as in the small area of Ascher, a crest on their heads, a snout like a pig, and with 2 wings. This then lasted several days, such that more than 400 of them flew together each day, both big and small, just as is painted here. The accompanying illustration shows dozens of these creatures soaring through a blue sky over a pastoral landscape. They have long serpentine bodies, bat-like wings, crowned heads, and pig-like snouts, exactly as the text describes. They fly in swirling formations, some diving toward the earth while others climb toward the heavens. The scene has an almost playful quality, as if the artist had enjoyed imagining these fantastical beasts, yet the text makes clear that this was reported as a real event witnessed by hundreds of people over multiple days. What did the people of Bohemia actually see in October 1533? Migrating birds, perhaps? Their formations misinterpreted by superstitious peasants? Unusual cloud formations catching the autumn light? A complete fabrication, invented by a broadsheet publisher seeking to sell copies to a credulous public? Or something genuinely inexplicable, a mass sighting of aerial phenomena that defied the categories of 16th century understanding? The Book of Miracles offers no interpretation. Unlike many similar collections of prodigies and portents from this era, the Augsburg manuscript contains almost no moralistic commentary. It does not explain what these signs mean or warn readers to repent of their sins. It simply presents the phenomena, one after another, in vivid and often disturbing detail. The reader is left to draw their own conclusions. The manuscript's depictions of celestial phenomena bear an uncanny resemblance to modern accounts of unidentified flying objects. Page after page shows spheres, crosses, tubes, and other geometric shapes hovering in Renaissance skies, sometimes apparently engaged in aerial combat. While the Book of Miracles does not depict the famous celestial phenomenon over Nuremberg that occurred in 1561, 9 years after the manuscript's completion, it documents the same kind of sightings that would make that event legendary. The Nuremberg event, which occurred on April 14, 1561, was recorded in a broadsheet illustrated with a woodcut by the local artist Hans Glaser. According to this account, the citizens of Nuremberg witnessed what appeared to be an aerial battle at dawn, the sky filled with cylindrical shapes from which emerged black, red, orange, and blue-white spheres that darted about erratically. Blood-red crosses appeared between the spheres. Finally, a large black triangular object appeared, and then various objects fell to earth, vanishing in clouds of smoke. Hans Glaser's text concluded with a warning typical of the era. The God-fearing will by no means discard these signs, but will take it to heart as a warning of their merciful Father in heaven, will mend their lives and faithfully beg God that he avert his wrath, including the well-deserved punishment, on us, so that we may, temporarily here and perpetually there, live as his children. 5 years later, in 1566, a similar series of events allegedly occurred over Basel, Switzerland. On July 27th, the setting sun turned a vivid vermilion and appeared to weep tears of blood. The following night brought a total lunar eclipse, during which the moon glowed blood red. On August 7th, large black spheres appeared near the sun, moving erratically at high speeds, some turning fiery red before disintegrating in the air, while others vanished near the sun after apparent clashes. The Basel event was documented by the historian Samuel Coxius and the printer Samuel Apiarius in a broadsheet that has survived in the Zentralbibliothek Zurich. The illustration shows swirling black and white spheres surrounding a sun with wild asymmetrical rays and a perturbed facial expression. The text exhorted faithful believers to see these phenomena as signs from the divine, akin to the miracles mentioned in the Bible. What were these 16th century observers actually witnessing? Modern skeptics have proposed various explanations. The phenomena may have been sundogs or parhelia, atmospheric optical effects caused by the refraction of sunlight through ice crystals in high cirrus clouds. Sundogs can create the illusion of multiple suns, bright spots of light, and geometric halos around the sun. They were well known in the ancient world. Aristotle and Cicero both wrote about them. But sundogs do not typically appear to fight one another. They do not fall to earth in clouds of smoke. They do not make sounds like crashing or chattering. Whatever the people of Nuremberg and Basel witnessed, It exceeded the usual characteristics of atmospheric optical phenomena. The Swiss historian Carl Jung, in his 1958 book Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies, offered a psychological interpretation of such events. Jung suggested that the sightings represented archetypal projections of the collective unconscious, symbols of wholeness and transformation that emerge during times of social stress. The 16th century, with its religious warfare and millennial anxiety, provided fertile ground for such projections. Others have noted that the visual language of these sightings drew heavily from contemporary military experience. The tubes that appeared over Nuremberg resembled cannons, and the spheres resembled cannonballs. The crosses were obvious religious symbols. The people of the 16th century interpreted what they saw through the lens of their own experience, just as modern observers might describe unidentified aerial phenomena in terms of aircraft and spacecraft. The phenomenon of multiple suns, or parhelia, appears repeatedly throughout the Book of Miracles and in numerous other accounts from the 16th century. One of the most famous and best documented occurrences took place on April 20th, 1535, over the city of Stockholm, Sweden. For 2 hours that morning, the skies over Stockholm were filled with white circles and arcs crossing the sky, while additional suns appeared around the true sun. The sight was so extraordinary that the Lutheran scholar and reformer Olaus Petri commissioned a painting to commemorate it. Known as the Vädersolstavlan, or the Sundog painting, it is considered the oldest known colour depiction of the city of Stockholm and one of the earliest artistic representations of parhelia. The event occurred at a moment of intense religious and political tension. King Gustav Vasa had broken with the Catholic Church and established Lutheranism as the state religion of Sweden just a decade earlier. Catholics interpreted the multiple suns as divine punishment for this apostasy, while Lutherans saw them as a blessing upon the new faith. The painting itself became embroiled in political controversy when the king took offence at some aspect of its imagery, and Olaus Petri narrowly escaped execution for having commissioned it. A similar parhelion had appeared on February 2, 1461, before the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in England during the Wars of the Roses. The Yorkist commander Edward, Earl of March, who would later become King Edward IV, witnessed 3 suns in the sky on the cold morning before the battle. His troops were initially frightened by the apparition, but Edward convinced them that it represented the Holy Trinity blessing their cause. The Yorkists won a decisive victory that day, and Edward later adopted the sun in splendour as his personal emblem, a symbol that appears on heraldic devices to this day. William Shakespeare dramatised this event in his play Henry VI, Part 3, giving Edward the lines, "3 glorious suns, each one a perfect sun, not separated with the racking clouds, but severed in a pale, clear, shining sky. See, they join, embrace, and seem to kiss, as if they vowed some league inviolable. Now are they but one lamp, one light, one sun." In this, the heaven figures some event. The Book of Miracles includes multiple depictions of parhelia, each painted with the same care and attention to detail as the manuscript's more fantastical imagery. To the 16th century mind, there was no fundamental distinction between sundogs and dragons, between atmospheric optical effects and supernatural visitations. All were signs from God, messages written across the vault of heaven for those with eyes to see. The manuscript's fascination with celestial phenomena extended to comets, those periodic visitors that had terrified humanity since the dawn of recorded history. The appearance of Halley's Comet in 1456 had coincided with the Ottoman siege of Belgrade, and Pope Calixtus III had ordered church bells to be rung at noon throughout Christendom to call the faithful to prayer against the Turkish threat. A later legend, 1875, biography, and subsequently embellished by the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace, claimed that Calixtus III had actually excommunicated the comet, declaring it an instrument of the devil. The Jesuit priest William Rigg examined all surviving documents from the brief pontificate of Calixtus III and found no mention of the comet whatsoever. The tale nonetheless persisted, testimony to the power of a good story and to the assumed credulity of the medieval church. What is certain is that comets genuinely terrified the people of the 15th and 16th centuries. In 1528, the French physician Ambroise Paré described a comet in terms that reveal the depth of contemporary fear. This comet was so horrible, so frightful, and it produced such great terror that some died of fear and others fell sick. The Book of Miracles depicts comet after comet blazing across the sky, their fiery tails streaming behind them as terrified observers gaze upward from walled cities and pastoral landscapes. The connection between comets and disaster seemed self-evident to 16th century observers. Comets had preceded the Black Death, the fall of Constantinople, the invasion of Italy by the French King Charles VIII. They would continue to herald catastrophe in the years to come. When Halley's Comet returned in 1910, despite centuries of scientific progress that had revealed comets to be nothing more than balls of ice and rock following predictable orbital paths, charlatans still sold comet pills and comet insurance to terrified Americans, convinced that the Earth's passage through the comet's tail would release deadly cyanide gas. Among the most striking and historically significant images in the Book of Miracles is its depiction of the so-called Tiber monster, or Papa Asino, the Popas. According to the manuscript and numerous other contemporary sources, this grotesque creature washed up on the banks of the Tiber River in Rome following a devastating flood in December 1495. The flood itself was a real and well-documented event. Days of heavy rain had caused the Tiber to rise 24 feet above its normal level, inundating the low-lying areas of Rome where more than 60% of the population lived. Thousands drowned or lost their homes. When the waters finally receded in January 1496, rumours began to circulate that a monstrous creature had been found among the muddy detritus. The monster, as depicted in the Book of Miracles and in numerous woodcuts and pamphlets of the era, was a chimera of human and animal parts. It had the head of a donkey, the torso and left hand of a woman, the right arm ending in an elephant's trunk, one leg of a donkey and the other a raptor's talon, a tail consisting of a dragon's neck and head, and a fiendish old man's face on its buttocks. Scales covered parts of its body, and it appeared both grotesque and vaguely human. Whether any such creature actually existed is impossible to determine. The flood was real, and it is possible that some badly decomposed body, human or animal, was found in its aftermath and interpreted through the lens of contemporary fears and expectations. But the significance of the Tiber monster lies not in its physical reality. Martin Luther and his colleague Philip Melanchthon seized upon the monster as a devastating piece of anti-Catholic propaganda. In 1523, they published a tract called The Popas Explained, featuring a woodcut by Lucas Cranach the Elder. Melanchthon provided an elaborate interpretation of each of the monster's features. The ass's head represented the Pope himself, a fool and an ignoramus. The female torso represented the carnal body of the Church. The scales represented the secular princes who had attached themselves to papal power. The dragon's tail represented the papal bulls and decrees that threatened spiritual destruction. The Tiber monster became one of the most famous images of the Protestant Reformation, reproduced in countless pamphlets and broadsheets throughout Europe. It appeared in the Nuremberg Chronicle and in Conrad Lycosthenes' Chronicle of Prodigies and Portents, published in Basel in 1557. It was used as evidence of God's displeasure with the corruption of the Roman Church and as a sign of the approaching end times. The creature's appearance in the Book of Miracles, alongside biblical events and celestial phenomena, demonstrates the fluidity of categories in the 16th century imagination. To the manuscript's creator and patron, the Tiber monster belonged to the same class of divine signs as the parting of the Red Sea and the dragons over Bohemia. All were messages from God, warnings to a sinful world of the judgment to come. The Book of Miracles is not unique in its concerns, though it is uniquely beautiful and comprehensive in its execution. It belongs to a genre of Renaissance literature known as wonder books or prodigy books, collections of signs and portents gathered from ancient and contemporary sources and interpreted as evidence of divine communication with humanity. The most famous of these works is the Chronicle of Prodigies and Portents by Conrad Lycosthenes, published in Basel in 1557. Lycosthenes, whose real name was Conrad Wolfart, was a Swiss humanist, theologian, and professor of grammar who had developed a passion for the study of natural phenomena and what he perceived to be supernatural interventions in the natural order. Lycosthenes' chronicle contains more than 500 woodcut illustrations depicting every conceivable type of prodigy, from celestial phenomena and monstrous births to earthquakes, floods, plagues, and invasions. The book begins with the serpent speaking to Eve in the Garden of Eden and continues through the year 1557, with the final 60 pages devoted to events from 1550 onward that Lycosthenes himself had witnessed or gathered from contemporary reports. In his preface, Lycosthenes explained his theological rationale for collecting these wonders. Prodigies and portents, he argued, were not purely fortuitous events. They showed God's anger and severity towards crimes and foretell great changes in the world. While such happenings often had natural causes, God was nature's master and used it when he wished to show his favour or disfavour towards mankind. Michel Nostradamus, who was writing his famous prophecies during the same period, borrowed numerous omen reports directly from the Chronicle. Much of the book was later translated into English by Dr. Stephen Batman in his The Doom Warning to All Men of 1581, which supplemented it with reports gathered from England during the intervening years. Another influential work in this genre was the Histoires prodigieuses by the French writer Pierre Boaistuau, published in 1560. Like Lycosthenes, Boaistuau collected accounts of monstrous births, celestial phenomena, and other wonders, though his approach was more curious and proto-scientific than theological. The interest in such phenomena that these books reflect and encouraged would eventually evolve into the empirical scientific investigation of nature, but in the 16th century the line between science and superstition remained indistinct. The Protestant Reformation provided the ideological framework within which the Book of Miracles must be understood. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, challenging the Catholic Church's sale of indulgences, he set in motion a religious revolution that would reshape European civilization. But Luther himself was deeply apocalyptic in his thinking. He believed that he was living in the last days before Christ's return, and he interpreted the signs of the times accordingly. Luther identified the Pope as the Antichrist, the man of sin whose appearance was prophesied in the biblical book of 2 Thessalonians. The book of Revelation, with its visions of beasts and plagues and cosmic warfare, provided a template for understanding contemporary events. The Turkish advance from the east, the corruption of the church, the religious wars tearing Christendom apart, all seemed to confirm that the final days were at hand. This apocalyptic mindset was particularly intense in the German-speaking lands, where the Reformation had originated. The Anabaptist movement, which emerged in the 1520s as a radical offshoot of the Protestant Reformation, produced numerous prophets who proclaimed the imminent end of the world and the establishment of Christ's kingdom on earth. The most notorious of these movements culminated in the takeover of the city of Munster in 1535, by a group of Anabaptists led by Jan Mathis and Jan van Leyden, who declared the city the New Jerusalem and instituted a regime of communal property and polygamy before being crushed by a combined Catholic and Lutheran army. Even among mainstream Protestants, the expectation of the approaching end remained strong. The Augsburg Confession of 1530, the foundational document of Lutheran theology, was presented to Emperor Charles V at a diet held in Augsburg itself. Just 20 years before the Book of Miracles was completed, Augsburg had been at the centre of the great religious drama of the age. The Peace of Augsburg, signed in 1555, temporarily resolved the religious conflict by establishing the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose region, his religion. Each prince of the Holy Roman Empire was allowed to determine whether his territory would be Catholic or Lutheran, and subjects who disagreed were permitted to emigrate. This solution brought a measure of peace, but it also institutionalized the religious divide and set the stage for the far more destructive 30 Years' War that would erupt in 1618. The Book of Miracles, completed around 1552, captures the anxiety and expectation of the years immediately preceding this settlement. Its pages overflow with signs and wonders, each one potentially the harbinger of the final judgment. The fiery comets, the multiple suns, the dragons and monsters all testified to a world in which the supernatural constantly intruded upon the natural, and in which every unusual event demanded interpretation as a message from God. The rediscovery of the Book of Miracles in 2007 created a sensation in the world of art history and manuscript studies. The book's leaves had been rebound in the 19th century, and some pages had been lost over the centuries, but the surviving 169 folios represented an almost complete record of one of the most ambitious artistic projects of the German Renaissance. The Taschen facsimile edition, published in 2013, made the manuscript's contents available to a wide audience for the first time. The box set included a complete reproduction of all surviving pages, along with transcriptions of the German text and translations into English, French and German. Essays by Till Holger Borchert, an expert in German medieval art, and Joshua Waterman of the Germanisches National Museum provided scholarly context for the manuscript and its place in Renaissance culture. The response to the publication revealed the enduring power of the Book of Miracles. Journalists and bloggers described the illustrations as proto-fantasy and proto-science fiction, noting their resemblance to modern depictions of alien encounters and apocalyptic disaster. The dragons over Bohemia could have appeared in a fantasy novel. The spheres and tubes over 16th century cities looked uncannily like UFOs. This resemblance is not coincidental. The human imagination has always populated the skies with wonders and terrors, from the dragons and phoenixes of ancient mythology to the flying saucers of contemporary culture. When people see something in the sky that they cannot explain, they interpret it through the symbolic language available to them. In the 16th century, that language was predominantly religious, drawing on biblical imagery and medieval cosmology. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the language of science fiction has largely replaced theological discourse, but the underlying psychological phenomena may be similar. Carl Jung recognized this continuity when he analyzed the Nuremberg broadsheet and other historical accounts of celestial phenomena in his study of flying saucers. Jung argued that such sightings represented the projection of archetypal images from the collective unconscious, symbols of psychic wholeness that emerged during times of social crisis. The specific content of the projections, whether crosses and spheres or disc-shaped spacecraft, depends on the cultural context, but the underlying impulse towards such projection remains constant. Whether or not one accepts Jung's psychological framework, the historical record demonstrates that strange sights in the sky have been reported by credible witnesses throughout human history. The Book of Miracles provides a window into how one particular culture, at one particular moment of crisis and transformation, understood and represented such experiences. The manuscript that emerged from a Munich auction house in 2007 had travelled a long and largely unknown path through the centuries. Its original patron remains unidentified, as does the workshop that produced its magnificent illustrations. The book passed through unknown hands before being rebound in the 19th century, losing some of its pages in the process. It somehow survived the catastrophic destruction of 2 world wars that devastated Germany's cultural heritage. Today, the original manuscript resides in the collection of the American art collector, Mickey Cartin, who has made it available for exhibition and scholarly study. In 2021, selected pages were displayed at the David Zwirner Gallery in New York as part of an exhibition titled Seen in the Mirror, Things from the Cartin Collection. Visitors stood transfixed before images of fiery comets and flying dragons, monstrous births and apocalyptic visions, created nearly 500 years ago by artists whose names have been lost to history. The Book of Miracles continues to fascinate because it speaks to something deep and persistent in human experience. We still watch the skies for signs and wonders. We still seek meaning in unusual events. We still fear that the world as we know it might end, whether through divine judgment, nuclear war, climate change, or asteroid impact. The specific content of our anxieties has changed, but the underlying structure of apocalyptic thinking remains remarkably stable. The 16th century residents of Augsburg who commissioned and created the Book of Miracles lived in a world that was genuinely ending. The unified Christendom of the Middle Ages was fragmenting into warring Protestant and Catholic factions. The comfortable certainties of medieval cosmology were beginning to give way before the observations of astronomers like Copernicus and, soon, Galileo. The discovery of the Americas had revealed that the known world was far larger and stranger than anyone had imagined. Traditional social hierarchies were being challenged by new forms of commerce and communication. In such circumstances, it is perhaps not surprising that people looked to the heavens for guidance, or that they interpreted what they saw there through the lens of biblical prophecy and millennial expectation. The dragons over Bohemia, the spheres over Nuremberg, the three suns over Stockholm, all were attempts to make sense of a world that seemed to be spinning out of control. The Book of Miracles stands as a monument to human creativity, human anxiety. Its pages preserve the fears and fantasies of a vanished world, rendered in pigments that have retained their brilliance across 5 centuries. The dragons still fly over Bohemia, the comets still blaze across the painted sky, the Tiber monster still gazes out with its ass's head and its dragon's tail, as vivid and as strange as the day the unknown artists first applied brush to paper. For modern viewers, the manuscript offers multiple levels of meaning. As a work of art, it demonstrates the technical mastery and imaginative range of Renaissance German illustration at its finest. As a historical document, it provides invaluable evidence about the beliefs, fears, and expectations of 16th century Europeans during one of the most turbulent periods in Western history. As a psychological study, it reveals the timeless human tendency to seek meaning in unusual events and to interpret the unknown through the symbolic language of the moment. Perhaps most importantly, the Book of Miracles reminds us of how much we have in common with our ancestors, despite the vast differences in our knowledge and technology. When the residents of Nuremberg looked up at the dawn sky on April 14, 1561, and saw spheres and crosses engaged in apparent aerial combat, they felt the same mixture of fear and wonder that we would feel if confronted with something equally inexplicable. They reached for the interpretive frameworks available to them, just as we reach for ours. They recorded what they saw as best they could, just as we record our own anomalous experiences. The truth of what happened over Nuremberg in 1561, or over Bohemia in 1533, or over Basel in 1566, may never be known. Perhaps these events were atmospheric optical phenomena, misinterpreted by superstitious observers and elaborated by sensation-seeking publishers. Perhaps they were mass hallucinations, collective visions produced by the intense religious anxiety of the era. Perhaps they were something else entirely, something that our modern categories are no better equipped to explain than the medieval concept of divine portents. What we can say with certainty is that the people who witnessed these events found them meaningful enough to record, and that the patron who commissioned the Book of Miracles found them significant enough to preserve in one of the most beautiful manuscripts of the German Renaissance. Their testimony, painted in gouache and watercolour on pages that have survived for nearly half a millennium, continues to challenge and inspire us. The Book of Miracles, lost for centuries and now recovered, takes its place among the great documents of human wonder. It reminds us that the sky has always been a screen upon which humanity projects its deepest fears and highest hopes. Whether we see dragons or spacecraft, divine judgment or atmospheric phenomena, we are participating in a tradition that stretches back to the dawn of human consciousness. In the end, the Augsburg Book of Miraculous Signs is not merely a record of what 16th century Germans believed they saw in the heavens. It is a mirror in which we can see our own capacity for wonder, our own need for meaning, our own place in a cosmos that remains, despite all our scientific progress, fundamentally mysterious and awe-inspiring. The dragons still fly over Bohemia, and we still look up, searching the sky for signs,